I accepted the position of Chief Executive Officer of FTX in the early morning hours of November 11. Immediately, it became clear to me that Chapter 11 was the best course available to preserve any remaining value of FTX. Therefore, my first act as CEO was to authorize the Chapter 11 filings. I've implemented a 5-part bankruptcy plan, which is detailed in my written statement. Our overarching objective is to maximize value for FTX customers and creditors so that we can mitigate to the greatest extent possible the harm suffered by so many. The FTX Group's collapse appears to stem from absolute concentration of control in the hands of a small group of grossly inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals who failed to implement virtually any of the systems or controls that are necessary for a company entrusted with other people's money or assets. Some of the unacceptable management practices have identified so far include the use of computer infrastructure that gave individuals in senior management access to systems that stored customer assets without security controls to prevent them from redirecting those assets. The storing of certain private keys to access hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto assets without effective security controls or encryption. The ability of Alameda to borrow funds held at FTX.com to be utilized for its own trading or investments without any effective limits whatsoever. The commingling of assets, the lack of complete documentation for transactions involving nearly 500 separate investments made with FTX Group funds and assets, and the absence of audited or reliable financial statements, the lack of personnel in financial and risk management functions, and the absence of independent governance throughout the FTX Group. A fundamental challenge we face is that we're in many respects starting from near zero in terms of the corporate infrastructure and record keeping that one would expect in a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Still, in just over 4 weeks, we've instituted meaningful steps to gain command and control, and every week we gain a better understanding of what occurred and the path forward, all of which will be shared with interested parties and affected parties throughout the Chapter 11 processes. The scope of our investigation is truly enormous. It involves detailed tracing of money flows and asset transfers from the time of FTX's founding and complex technological efforts to identify and trace crypto assets. We are in the process of collecting and reviewing dozens of terabytes of documents and data, including billions of individual transactions, and we're leveraging sophisticated technology and expertise to identify and trace additional transactions and assets. While many things are unknown at this stage, we're at a very preliminary stage, many questions remain. We know the following. First, customer assets at FTX.com were commingled with assets from the Alameda trading platform. That much is clear. Second, Alameda used client funds to engage in margin trading, which exposed customer funds to massive losses. Third, the FTX Group went on a spending binge in 2021 and 2022, during which $5 billion was spent on a myriad of businesses and investments, many of which may only be worth a fraction of what was paid for them. Fourth, loans and other payments were made to insiders in excess of $1.5 billion. Fifth, Alameda's business model as a market maker required funds to be deployed to various third-party exchanges, which were inherently unsafe and further exacerbated by the limited protections offered in certain of those foreign jurisdictions. I know that resolution of the Chapter 11 process, as well as the investigation into the causes of the FTX Group's collapse, are of keen interest to this committee and to your constituents. Although, there are many who need and deserve answers. There's customers, there's creditors, there's investors, counterparties, employees, and regulators. We're positioning ourselves to provide each of these constituents with answers that they deserve. Although a bankruptcy proceeding of this unprecedented nature will take some time to run its course, I'm committed to working as quickly as possible to investigate what happened, formulate conclusions, and hopefully inform the committee's work here. I should note that my ability to comment on certain of the matters today will be inherently limited by the state of FTX's records, ongoing bankruptcy proceedings, and of course, the numerous ongoing investigations by the U.S. law enforcement regulators. I look forward to answering your questions to the best of my ability. Thank you again for allowing me to present in front of this committee. Thank you. The operations of the XTF Group were not segregated. It was really operated as one company. As a result, there's no distinction virtually between the operations of the company and who controlled those operations. The loans that were given to Mr. Bankman-Fried were not just one loan, it was numerous loans, some of which were documented by individual promissory notes. There's no description of what the purpose of the loan was. In one instance, he signed both as the issuer of the loan as well as the recipient of the loan. But we have no information at this time as to what the purpose or the use of those funds were, and that is part of our investigation. Thank you. The operation of Alameda really depended, based on the way it was operated, for the use of customer funds. That's the major breakdown here. Funds from FTX.com, which was the exchange for non-U.S. citizens. Those funds were used at Alameda to make investments and other disbursements. There were virtually no internal controls and no separateness whatsoever. For structural purposes and just for ease of presentation, we tried to take the over 100 entities and we put those in 4 silos. To demystify that, it's very simple. There was a U.S. silo, which was the FTX U.S. exchange for U.S. investors. There was an international exchange called FTX.com, again for non-U.S. persons that invested in crypto. There was Alameda, which is purely a crypto hedge fund, which made other investments, venture capital type investments. Then there's a 4th entity, which was purely investments, and although our investigation is not complete, those investments were most likely made with either Alameda money or money that originally came from FTX.com. But that 4th silo is just purely investments.
And who owned those 4 silos?
All those entities were, owned or controlled by Sam Bankman-Fried.
Okay. And so can you describe the differences between the FTX.com and FTX US silos?
Yes. Very simply, FTX US was for US citizens who wanted to trade crypto. FTX.com was for, U.S. citizens were not allowed to trade on that exchange. That's very simple. And I would make one other comment, which is separate and apart from any of those 2 silos. It was Ledger X, which is a regulated entity regulated by the CFTC, solvent and separate from the FTX U.S. silo.
Okay. And that is a distinct silo. That's a distinct company.
That is a distinct company within the U.S. silo, yes.
Okay. So then Alameda Research and the venture capital businesses, what did Alameda Research do?
Essentially made crypto investments, engaged in margin trading, took long and short positions in crypto, essentially invested in crypto. But of course, we now know also invested in over $5 billion of other assets, which are in a variety of sectors.
And what was the practice between Alameda Research and FTX.com? Have you established anything you can disclose to us today?
In essence, Alameda was a user, effectively a customer of FTX.com. That's how it was essentially structured.
Was that a distinct set of capital between those 2 companies?
Well, we now know the answer to that is no.
No. Okay. And with the information you have right now, when approximately did FTX begin to experience financial trouble?
Well, it was first disclosed to the public beginning around November 2nd, but when this began was months, if not, earlier years. Our investigation is continuing. But this is not something that happened overnight or in the context of a week.
Okay. So you had the distinction between FTX US, FTX.com, Alameda Research. What was the relationship between FTX.com and FTX US? Was there a distinction between the two?
There was a public distinction between the two. What we're seeing, though, is that the crypto assets for both FTX.com and for FTX US, were housed in the same database. It's called the AWS system, which is just an acronym for Amazon Web Services. It was all housed in the same web format.
And is that distinct from Alameda's assets?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So in your testimony, you said that there is, quote, an absence of independent governance throughout the FTX group, end quote. Yet Mr. Bankman-Fried has said that, quote, he wasn't running Alameda or making decisions on the Alameda side, end quote. Is this an accurate statement by Mr. I assume you're going to say your statement's accurate. Is Mr. Bankman-Fried's statement accurate?
I don't know the basis for his comment. I will note that he owned 90% of Alameda.
So, but you've seen no distinction in governance between the two?
Oh, absolutely not. There's no distinction whatsoever. The owners of the company could really run free rein across all four silos. One thing that we found, which, every case is different. The challenges of every case is different. The issue here that I was speaking to is I've just never seen an utter lack of record keeping. Absolutely no internal controls whatsoever. And of course, this case is then made difficult in that context when you're dealing with technology.
Mr. Ray, a number of debtors in the FTX group are located in offshore jurisdictions. Will this complicate the efforts to retrieve the assets of those debtors? If so, why?
No, I don't think it will complicate it at all. The various jurisdictions historically in bankruptcy, and I've been in a number of cross-border situations, the jurisdictions will cooperate with each other. The regulators in all these jurisdictions, I think, realize that everyone's there for a common purpose to protect the victims and to recover assets for the victims of these situations.
How much have you been able to secure, and where are most of these assets located?
We've been able to secure, over $1 billion of assets. We've secured those to cold wallets in a secure location. It's an ongoing process, though, which will take, weeks and perhaps months to secure all of the assets.
Are most creditors located in the U.S. or foreign jurisdictions?
The majority of the creditors trade through the .com silo and are outside of this jurisdiction, although there are some foreign customers that are on the U.S. silo and vice versa.
So it is my understanding you established 4 silos. Can you explain why you believe establishing these silos and taking this approach will maximize asset recovery for creditors? And do you think this approach could help determine what happened to the $1 billion that is gone missing?
Yes. So one of the reasons why we set up the silos the way we did was to first focus on the FTX silo for the U.S. It's a relatively smaller trading volume, fewer users. It's truly meant, to be for the U.S. customers. The .com silo is really for non-U.S. customers, so there's a logical reason why we separated those two out. The Alameda fund, well, that's just the fund that that drew resources from the exchanges. So it's really separate. It was not for customers per se. It was just simply a hedge fund.
As we here in Congress consider the possibility of legislation in this area, what is the one thing that you have seen in your short amount of time at FTX that you will urge us to keep in mind or is needed the most?
You know, I don't want to speak to you know, detailed regulations or make observations about regulations. That's certainly not an area of my expertise. However, we're dealing with people's money and their assets. And, you know, my basic observation is you need records, you need controls, and you need to segregate people's money.
Thank you.
That's simple.
Can you please elaborate on some of the specific ways FTX is worse than one of the largest corporate frauds in history?
The FTX group is unusual in the sense that, you know, I've done probably a dozen large, you know, scale bankruptcies over my career, you know, including Enron, of course. Every one of those entities had some financial problem or another. They have some characteristics that are in common. This one is unusual, and it's unusual in the sense that literally, you know, there's no record keeping whatsoever. It's in the absence of record keeping. Employees would communicate, you know, invoicing and expenses on Slack, which is, you know, essentially a way of communicating for chat rooms. They use Quickbooks, a multi-billion-dollar company using Quickbooks.
QuickBooks?
Quickbooks. Nothing against Quickbooks, very nice tool, just not for a multi-billion-dollar company. There's no independent board, right? We had one person really controlling this, no independent board. That's highly unusual in a size company this is. And it's made all more complex because we're not dealing with, you know, widgets or, you know, or something that's tangible. We're dealing with crypto, and the technological issues are made worse when you're dealing with an asset such as crypto.
Mr. Ray, Mr. Bankman-Fried has apologized. I'll subquote here, for mistakes he has made. Based on your review, is there a way to know if the transfer of FTX customer funds to Alameda Research was done by mistake?
I don't find any such statements to be credible.
Reports suggest that FTX.com transferred more than half of its customer funds, roughly $10 billion, to Alameda Research. Is that accurate, sir?
Our work is not done. We don't have exact numbers for you today, but I will say it's several $billion in that range. So we know the size of the harm was significant.
Mr. Ray, FTX.com held itself out as having a sophisticated risk management system commensurate with the size of its operations. You've touched on this a little bit. Based on your work to date, is this accurate? And can you explain the, quote, sophistication of its risk management system?
I can say that's absolutely false. There was no sophistication whatsoever. There was an absence of any management.
Mr. Ray, Mr. Bankman-Fried has been able to confuse interviewers by talking in circles around the multiple business activities of FTX.com. Mr. Ray, would you break down for us the different business, quote, activities of FTX.com?
You know, much of this I've described. Essentially, they had two exchanges for allowed users to trade crypto. And then there was the hedge fund. It's as simple as that. The users, you know, were allowed to make a variety of investments. They had a more expansive ability to trade crypto if you were a non-U.S. citizen on the .com exchange. But I know it's been described publicly as very complex, and it is to some extent. But essentially, you had two exchanges, and you had a hedge fund. Inside both the U.S. silo, as I've mentioned, and inside the silos for .com, there were regulated entities. We have regulated entities that are, for example, in Japan that are solvent. We had a regulated entity, Ledger X, that was solvent. Those are sort of distinct from the other basic operations that we had, which was the two exchanges.
Mr. Ray, you're going to be looking at FTX. We know that Sam Bankman-Fried is already faces criminal charges, but he did have help. Will you be looking for and turning over to U.S. Law enforcement authorities information about the possible criminal actions by Ryan Salome, Carolyn Ellison, and the other folks in the fancy apartment?
We are doing a thorough investigation, and we will, of course, we have been cooperating with the U.S. regulators and law enforcement agencies, so we will cooperate to turn over any information that would be relevant to them.
Thank you. And I'll point out in particular that one of the counts, count 8 in the complaint or indictment, is violation of campaign finance laws. And I hope that what you will turn over is a list of the major bonuses and or loans. It's reported that Ryan Salome got a $55 million loan, so that law enforcement can piece together when those loans and bonuses were made and whether they immediately preceded illegal campaign, disguised campaign contributions. Can we count on you to do that?
Yes, I can confirm that.
It's our understanding that some of the FTX entities were not included in bankruptcy, including Ledger X. Could you explain why those entities were not included and what might ultimately happen with them?
Ledger X is a perfect example of the entities that were kept out of bankruptcy. It's a regulated entity. It's fully solvent. The customer funds were segregated. We believe that there's been no harm there whatsoever. There's no reason to put it into bankruptcy. Ultimately, we will look to sell Ledger X and put it in the hands of a good steward.
And would you expand on how U.S. bankruptcy proceedings interact with international proceedings, for instance, like those in Australia?
Yes, the system is really designed to have a cooperative relationship with liquidators in other jurisdictions. We share information, we cooperate with each other relative to maximizing customer value and ultimately facilitating distributions and overall facilitation of the completion of the scheme in order to render customers as whole as possible.
As we've all seen, of course, SEC's charged Mr. Bankman-Fried with defaulting investors along with charges from the CFTC and the Southern District of New York. In your testimony, you described FTX Group as having unacceptable management practices, and you've made that graphically clear, in particular to how Mr. Bankman-Fried is accused of. The SEC specifically alleges that one way in which Mr. Bankman-Fried diverted FTX funds to Alameda Research was by directing customers to deposit cash into Alameda-controlled bank accounts. Mr. Ray, could you explain how FTX was able to conceal that?
We're still, somewhat early in our investigation, but we can confirm that funds were deposited directly into Alameda as opposed to FTX bank accounts. Unfortunate, obviously, situation.
One last question on the bankruptcy. It's been reported that FTX Digital and FTX Australia were not included in the bankruptcy filing because local regulators had already initiated their own proceedings. Is it true that they could not have been included because of that?
Yes, our filing occurred on November 11, and there was other filings that had occurred shortly before.
One last thought, Mr. Ray. Clearly, your profession is cleaning up messes that other people have made. That's a fair way to describe it. Not messes that you made, but they made. How does this compare, in your experience, magnitude-wise?
Well, it's
the worst or the worst by magnitudes?
It's one of the worst from a documentation standpoint. Even in the most failed companies, you have a fair roadmap of what happened. We're dealing with literally a sort of a paperless bankruptcy in terms of how they created this company. It makes it very difficult to trace and track assets, and particularly, as I've said, in the crypto world. It's really unprecedented in terms of the lack of documentation.
Bankman-Fried has pretty much indicated that he just made a big mistake, that he was doing the best that he could to be a servant and of great service to humankind. But I would also mention this: he did attend Canada USA Math Camp, a summer program for mathematically talented high school students. He also has a degree from MIT, 2014, bachelor's degree in physics with a minor in mathematics. Is all of this just one big mistake that was made by this gentleman, sir, as you see it, based upon what you've seen so far? It looks to me like there may be some malfeasance here.
You know, we're certainly, investigating everything that happened relative to these circumstances. At this stage, we're trying not to, lay judgment or put labels on actions. We're focused on, accumulating and maximizing the assets for the victims. That's our number one priority. In doing so, we will also investigate potential causes of actions to maximize value. And that does require us to get into the underlying facts and motivations and what happened. So we fully expect to explore that.
Thank you. Would you consider this to be sincere ignorance?
Again, I don't want to put labels on it. Obviously, there's been failure here of a massive proportion. Ultimately, like others will judge him by his actions.
What amount of money do you think that was held in FTX?
I'm not in a position really to give you individual numbers at this point. We do know with the U.S., there's hundreds of millions of dollars that were at stake. And of course, on the .com, which is the international exchange, that's in the billions of dollars. There's one of the difficulties we have is that there's millions of accounts. Some of those accounts, could be by multiple users. So we're in the process of really analyzing how those accounts roll up to individual customers.
Are you aware of the SEC at any point asking questions, coming to visit, providing paperwork about these hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that drew some attention from the SEC about this American investment, or what I would say exposure?
I'm not, but you have to recognize that I, parachuted in on November 11th, so I have no history with the company whatsoever.
So you do not know about any questions, interaction? Have you heard about whether there was an attempt to avoid any of this? Was any of it ever discussed by any of the people that you have gained information from?
I'm not privy to anything on a pre-petition basis.
Thank you. Do you have an idea about the value of assets that was lent to FTX, by FTX or Alameda to Mr. Bankman-Fried, the amount of money that they loaned him?
Well, we know that the size of the loss, measured essentially, at this period of time is several billion dollars, but you have to remember that, asset values, fluctuate. So how much the value assets are worth at the time that they may have been transferred to FTX.com may be a different number than the loss as of any particular date. We do, of course, know that we have several billion dollars of losses, and we know that there was billions of dollars lent out, billions of dollars of other investments, so that we essentially have a roadmap to figure that out.
The roadmap that you're speaking about, in your past, I don't claim you necessarily know it now, were IRS forms that were filled out by the company, were they properly filled out? Have you looked at those to see that they were complying with the IRS law?
We are looking into that very thing. We've hired Ernst & Young. They are taking a comprehensive review. They're going backwards and starting with the earlier years. We're reviewing the return that was filed in 2020, 2021, and of course, they're looking at all the transactions within 2022. So that review is ongoing, and we certainly will look at that in detail.
Could you expand or maybe even update us on the extent of the poor controls in the areas previously identified in your November 17th declaration?
It's an extensive list. It really crosses the entire spectrum of the company, from lack of lists of bank accounts, hundreds of bank accounts dispersed all over the world, lack of just a complete list of employees and their functions by group or name, extensive use of independent contractors as opposed to employees. Lack of insurance that you normally would see in certain businesses, either inadequate insurance or complete gaps in insurance. For example, the Alameda silo had no insurance whatsoever. So those are, the list goes on and on. We could spend all day on that.
Mr. Ray, it's been reported that FTX couldn't get a bank account for some time. As a result, FTX used Alameda Research's bank accounts. Does this raise any red flags for you, the fact they couldn't find a way to get a bank account?
Well, there's a few red flags. Obviously, the bank situation should have been a real red flag for someone being asked to deposit money into an account that was not the exchange account. Certainly should have been a red flag for customers. Any of the silos had in bank accounts, that certainly exists. Separate bank accounts do exist. I think the real issue here for us is that money was transferred from one account to the other, seemingly without limit. That is the issue.
One of the questions I've got is with regards to the Farmington State Bank. This is an investment that Alameda made into, and it's a little bitty bank according to a New York Times article. State of Washington, 26th smallest bank out of 4,800 in the country. They bought it in 2020, had a net worth of $5.7 million, and they dropped $11.5 million in for a percentage of the ownership. Do you know off the top of your head what the percentage of ownership was in that bank that they purchased?
I believe that ownership was approximately 10%, but I can.
Okay, that's what I've heard too. So therefore, they paid 20 times book, which is off the charts outrageous. So it should be a red flag over the place. Yet they were able to purchase that, even though it's a minority interest, but 20 times book. FDIC allowed that to happen. They changed names to Moonstone Bank. And since then, they've 4 separate accounts have dropped to roughly $71 million, again, according to FDIC data and according to this article. Have you looked at this relationship at all yet to see what's going on here and whether there was any irregularities at all?
We are looking at it. It certainly is one of the things that came to our attention fairly quickly. We're looking at what the dollars were that went from the FTX group to that bank, and we're looking at the connections of that bank to the Bahamas.
How long have you been on this job?
4 weeks.
4 weeks. Do you know when the Madoff bankruptcy was filed?
Probably circa 2008, I guess. I don't know.
So say 2008. And do you know they just made a distribution out of that bankruptcy last week?
That's what I understand, yes.
So that's, 14 years? How
Yes.
old are you?
Is that a permitted question?
Because I want you to add 100 to whatever your age is when you finally untangle all of this.
Well, certainly, clearly, and I think in our first day papers, we indicated that Mr. Bankman had given legal advice.
Okay, had he been an employee of FTX, as has been reported?
I don't know if he actually had an employee status, but he certainly received payments from, the family did receive payments.
Okay.
Well, first and foremost, there's no independent board of directors. So one of the first things that I did was put on an independent board of directors led by our chairperson, who's the former U.S. attorney and Honorable Joseph Farnan, the former U.S. District Court judge. So put in a corporate structure of independent directors, put in separate officers, the new officers of the company. I put in a new CFO, a new chief information officer, a new head of administration, all independent, with some background and experience in these sectors. None of the employees, I mean, there's a lot of titles in the company, but no experience to back it up.
Can you explain how the FTX.com governance structure differs from the governance structures of FTX US?
Virtually no difference. There was no structure.
Mr. Ray, in your work so far, have you examined the governance structure or the flow of assets to the FTX Foundation or its various affiliates, including FTX Community, FTX Climate, or the Future Fund?
We are digging into that. We've not completed our review.
I am curious in your work whether or not you will determine whether those entities were established properly as non-profits or whether or not the funds received were improperly transferred customer accounts. Do you have any visibility into that yet?
We're looking at that right now. We've asked our folks at Ernst & Young to look at the tax side of it, and we're investigating the money transfers. So you can be sure we're going to dig into those details.
Was the FTX Foundation and those other not-for-profit, ostensibly not-for-profit entities, were they completely separate from any of the for-profit entities?
They were owned by Sam Bankman-Fried. I can't tell you that they were separate because they got funds from Alameda. So we know the source of their funding was from the FTX group. There was separate ownership, but not separate, funding.
So commingled assets in that case as well?
Absolutely.
Okay. At least one ESG ratings firm gave FTX a higher score for governance than ExxonMobil. Given your testimony that FTX's collapse stems from the absolute concentration of control in the hands of a very small group of grossly inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals who failed to implement virtually any of the systems or controls necessary for a company that is entrusted with other people's money or assets, what would you say about this ESG governance rating, which rated FTX higher than ExxonMobil?
I'd get my money back.
Can you identify which entities had audited financial statements?
Yes, I can. So there was no audit at Alameda, no audit at the venture silo. There was audit at the U.S. silo and also audit at the .com silo. I can't speak to the integrity or quality of those audits. We're reviewing, obviously, the books and records. And as I've said earlier, much of those books and records were maintained on, fairly unsophisticated ledger workbooks.
And you testified of the lack of record keeping.
Yes.
And so there's a whole lot of financial statements that are either not audited or not available. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
In your declaration, you stated that you did not believe that those audited financial statements were reliable. Can you elaborate on why you believe that to be the case?
Well, we've lost $8 billion, right, of customer money. So by definition, I don't trust a single piece of paper in this organization.
Sam Bankman-Fried, in his testimony to this committee on December 8th of last year, said that FTX has designed and offered a platform with a market structure that is risk-reducing. To be sure, there are irresponsible actors in the digital asset industry, and those actors attract the headlines, but FTX is not one of them. Was that statement incorrect?
False. Enron was really a different company. The crimes that were committed there were highly orchestrated financial machinations by highly sophisticated people to keep transactions off balance sheets. This is really old-fashioned embezzlement. This is just taking money from customers and using it for your own purpose. Not sophisticated at all. Sophisticated perhaps in the way they were able to sort of hide it from people, frankly, right in front of their eyes. But this isn't sophisticated whatsoever. This is just plain old embezzlement.
Old school.
Old school.
There you go. Have you yet seen any evidence of a market value drop in Alameda's assets before November 2022?
We haven't gone back to trace, the actual, I mean, to compare his statements with what actually happened in the marketplace. I mean, clearly there was volatility and a huge market drop in crypto over that 12-month period. So it wouldn't surprise me that, his leverage numbers changed, perhaps even dramatically during that time period. I think the problem at the heart of this is that, his positions, the collateral he had behind that, he didn't have the same auto liquidation provision that a margin account would normally have. You usually can't lose, if it's structured properly, you shouldn't be able to lose more than your collateral. Otherwise, the position closes out and there's no harm. And the brokerage firm, if it's a brokerage account, for example, they wouldn't be short cash. They wouldn't have to go out to get the money from you. You close out the position. None of that existed with the Alameda positions. They had almost a complete ability to lose money beyond their collateral.
Are you yet in a position to be able to describe, summarize the assets that Alameda had?
We do have an inventory of the investments we made. That's pretty clear. We've got those in the hands of our investment bankers at Perella, and we're trying to understand those investments. Ultimately, we'll market those investments. You'll see this week that some of those investments will be put up for sale. The crypto assets, a little bit different. What's on the exchanges we can see. There's exchanges, about 24 exchanges across the world where we know we have crypto assets. They're in our name. We're securing those and are moving those into cold storage. We have, other positions in cold wallets and hot wallets. We've got visibility to that. The question really is, are there wallets that we don't know about? Certainly that is the potential, because the way this company was organized, there may be wallets that don't have our names, we don't know where they are, and that's going to be a difficult task ahead of us. But what we can see and what we have visibility to, we're grabbing control over.
He gave the Bahamian regulators a one-day advance warning to allow investors in the Bahamas to withdraw their funds. No one else outside the Bahamas was able to withdraw funds before the bankruptcy was filed. Mr. Fried said that he allowed the withdrawals because, quote, it was critical to the exchange to be able to have a future because that's where I am right now. And you do not want to be in a country with a lot of angry people in it. Is this explanation accurate?
Well, here's what we know. I mean, I can't speak to his words. What we do know is the liquidation proceeding in the Bahamas was filed effectively 24 hours before our Chapter 11 proceeding. During that time period, and we've documented this in our court filings as of last night, the accounts were unfrozen just in the Bahamas. Over $100 million was released to approximately 1,500 customers in the Bahamas.
Did you say 15 million or 15
100 million.
100 million.
To 1,500 customers approximately. Okay. These are approximate numbers.
Okay.
And then the door was closed about the time of our Chapter 11 filing. And there were communications between Mr. Bankman-Fried and the Bahamian government specifically related to this leakage of assets.
So Mr. Fried would have known that the bankruptcy filing was imminent when he did this?
Yes, he was certainly in discussions with his counsel, who was in discussions with the debtor's counsel.
Based on your review of the records, is the transfer of customer funds from FTX.com to Alameda Research in conflict with the FTX.com terms of service?
Yes, that's my view.
Right, so they claim that they weren't supposed to be able to trade those funds, and clearly they traded those funds.
I think that the difference in what you may be hearing is that unlike generally customer accounts, the Alameda account had no trading limitations, so virtually unlimited positions they could take.
Right. So when customers deposited funds into their FTX accounts, where did the cash go?
Well, sometimes the money wasn't deposited in the FTX account; it was sent to Alameda to begin with. So
So it was misdirected from the start, straight to Alameda.
There was certainly some time period where there's no bank account at .com. And then ultimately, if you look at the structure of this, Alameda was essentially a customer on that .com exchange and effectively, borrowed money from, or just transferred money from FTX customers to take its own positions on the Alameda hedge fund.
Right, so at times it was just going straight to Alameda. At other times, did you uncover a path where there was some sort of settlement, like in stocks where there's T+2, where there was settlement back and forth between FTX and Alameda?
Ultimately, when we look at this, I mean, there is going to be, I'm sure thousands and thousands of trades, right? So we're going to have to go back and do a very detailed analysis about every single.
But they didn't have a structured settlement framework at all in any of their software or accounting systems?
It doesn't appear so, no.
Okay, and have you ever done bankruptcies where you had to deal with custody of stocks?
Yes.
Yeah, so, obviously there you settle, clearly you own shares or you don't own shares. You take custody of the shares normally after a 2-day settlement period. There's a netting period where firms that trade in these net out and settle the position at the end of the day. It doesn't seem any of this kind of thing existed for FTX.
That's one of the findings. There was no reconciliation of the ledger on a day-to-day basis. So senior management literally could get access to any of the accounts in any of the silos. No separateness between customer money and other customer money or other assets. It's virtually unlimited in terms of the lack of controls. And that's really the point of the unprecedented comment. I've just never seen anything like it in all 40 years of doing restructuring work and corporate legal work. It's just a dearth of information. Well, ultimately, we hope the raw data is there, and through the expertise that we have, we will be able to assemble it. It'll be time consuming because it's raw data. The jump start you normally have in companies, we just don't have. So we're starting in near zero.
Do you have any evidence that suggests that data was willfully destroyed prior to your arrival in the company?
We have imaged the Slack environment that the company had, but we are aware that there were certain forms of communications with disappearing messaging. So there's obviously risk of loss there.
Have you determined whether, in fact, assets were moved out after the bankruptcy?
Yes, clearly there was assets moved out after the bankruptcy.
And do you know whether or not that was an actual hack, or was this done, as has been reported, at the direction of the Bahamian authorities?
It was both.
It was both. And so some was done, some was done as a result of a hack, some was done as a result of the request of the Bahamian authorities.
Yes, that's right.
And do you have indication as to why the Bahamian authorities made that request?
Well, it wasn't a request. They just took it.
The Bahamian authorities took the funds that were at FTX
Yes.
through their own action. Was no action required by FTX employees? Maybe you could provide just a little color.
They were aided by the ex-employees, yes.
They were aided by former employees
Yes,
of
Mr.
FTX.
Yes, Mr. Wang and Mr. Fried. FTT, which is a coin created by the company that could literally be minted. You could create new money with it. And so in that process, FTT was transferred to the Bahamian authorities.
To the tune of how much money?
Approximately
I read here
less than, about 300 million.
300 million. And you said that would be Mr. Bankman-Fried and Mr. Wang who did that minting and transferring. And it's
I know we have information that they were both involved, whether Mr. Wang did it or Mr. Fried, obviously they were cooperating with the government in doing so.
and this is post-bankruptcy filings.
Post-bankruptcy, when the automatic stay was in effect.
And arguably, you're going to be going after the $100 million that was allowed by 1,500 Bahamian citizens to take out that was allegedly owed. You're still going to get to the bottom of that. So you plan on going after that money, correct?
We'll investigate every potential cause of action.
And if 1,500 people in the Bahamas were allowed 25 and a half hours to withdraw $100 million. Do you plan on trying to get that back and distribute it appropriately?
We will certainly pursue every course of action to recover.
You haven't engaged with him and haven't allowed him access to his passwords and accounts. Can you explain to the committee now why that is the appropriate course of action?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, we wanted an independent, examination. We didn't want to rely on people who were potentially compromised, and as we now sit here today, we know that was a wise decision, right?
Yes.
Second of all, what he was asking for fundamentally was to allow access to a system that we know just hours after the bankruptcy filing, he had dissipated assets from the estate.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Without objection, I would like to enter into the record the closing statements from Ranking Member McHenry and myself. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. John Ray III.
Chairwoman Waters.
For your presence here today.
Chairwoman Waters, I've not had an opportunity to testify or to question the witness.
I'd like to thank you for your presence.
Chairwoman Waters,
And for the
parliamentary inquiry.
yes.
Are all members entitled to question witnesses?
You are, and if you would like to miss the votes on the floor for everybody.
Hey, it's
just
the
one
chairwoman's
moment.
prerogative to call
Just
a recess.
one moment,
That's your
please.
decision, not mine.
Just one moment, please. You may go right ahead and have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're certainly welcome, sir.
Mr. Ray, earlier today you said FTX was one of the worst bankruptcies you have handled in your 40 years of legal and restructuring experience. Under Mr. Bankman-Fried, FTX had almost no record keeping, risk management, or accounting. In fact, FTX had 0 accountants on their payroll. Mr. Bankman-Fried explained to Bloomberg Businessweek that FTX's accounting was done by him, and in his head, quote, "I was real lazy about the mental math. The complete lack of any basic record keeping makes it difficult to track down assets and untangle this mess. Are you aware of any additional wallets the co-founders potentially have access to that contain debtor assets?"
No, we're not.
Mr. Ray, thank you for you and your team, your willingness to participate today, and the forthright nature by which you've handled a hearing like this. We know there will be ongoing conversations in the new year. The title of this hearing was Part 1. Part 2 will be next year. And as chair of the committee, it's my intention to continue the work of Chairwoman Waters when it comes to this matter. We know more because of your testimony. You had somebody who's a crypto genius, but behind closed doors was using Quickbooks. We know somebody who was a pretender to the technology, but was doing everything possible to obscure something that is innately a transparent product. Now we understand why, a lot more of the why. We wish you well in resolving these matters and look forward to continuing the conversation.
The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.